assessments are going to use T-scores. So then our percentiles up here are a pretty good way of disseminating results to parents and people that may not be quite as well versed in testing and assessment. And so just in case you're not aware of how to interpret a percentile, so let's say a student scores, their score falls at the 20th percentile. Well, how you would interpret that is you would say this student's score fell at the 20th percentile, which means that his or her score is equal to or higher than 20% of the population that took that assessment. Also, when we think interpretively, so our average scores for scale score, right smack dab in the middle is a 10, and like 7 to 13 you can think of as like the straight average range. So between 4 and 7, generally going to be, you're going to interpret that as like borderline to low average. Anything above 13 is going to be high average, superior. That the qualitative descriptors really just depend on the assessment that you're using. 85 to 115 is the average range for standard scores. T-scores use a 10-point standard deviation, so 50 is the mean, 40 to 60 is the average range. And then for percentile ranks, it's a little bit different when you're discussing the ranges. Typically, percentile ranks are used as the primary descriptive tool with measures like curriculum-based measurement. So the 25th to the 75th percentile are generally, that's what is normally considered the average range, 25th to 75th. You can think another good way of describing that is low risk. So scores that fall within the 25th to the 75th percentile are in the low risk range. Scores that fall between the 10th and the 25th percentile, so like right in here, those are typically characterized as some risk, or like the yellow kids, tier 2 sorts of kids. And then scores that fall below the 10th percentile are generally considered at risk, red, tier 3 sorts of scores. This slide here provides you with some of the qualitative descriptors that are commonly used on commercially available achievement and intelligence tests, as well as, assessments that are used by speech and language pathologists, adaptive skill measures. Here's those qualitative descriptors. 85 to 115 is the average range, 85 to 80, low average, 70 to 79, borderline, 69 and below in the extremely low range. So there are some considerations of tests that have to be taken into account, and this goes back extensively. It goes way back into research and intelligence. So oftentimes some folks have leveled charges of bias against IQ assessment specifically, and we talked a little bit about that with the Larry P. case and Hannon versus Pace. And so bias has been checked for by test publishers through what's called differential item functioning. And so at an item by item level, it checks for systematic variance as a byproduct of group membership. So they go through and they take a look at each item, and if they see if one group is favored by that item, then they'll eliminate that item from the test. Now that's different than fairness. So fairness is related to that idea of consequential validity that you read about in the Messick article. And so are these tests, did the use of these tests lead to enhanced outcomes for the students they're used with? That's what it's all about. Bias can be measured. Fairness is a much more difficult concept to account for in your test usage. The final thing is instructional utility. And so instructional utility simply comes down to the fact that, do these tests that we use, do they lead to valuable instructional alterations? If they don't better inform our teaching, then what's the point? So, teach you a little calculation here to determine, for many of these commercially available tests, things like the Wyatt and intelligence tests and behavior assessments, it's necessary to calculate a chronological age. So rather than just saying the child's 9 years old, we need to know how many years, how many months, and how many days old. So it's a stepwise process. First, you just write down the date of testing, starting with the year, the month, and the day. And then directly below that, you write down the child's birth date from left to right. So the year, month, day. Calculation's pretty easy when you can do it, when you don't have to do any sort of borrowing or anything. So for instance, a child born on September 11th or August 9th, 2010, and they were tested on September 11th, 2017. That child at the time of testing was 7 years, 1 month, and 2 days old. If you want a technological alternative, you can just simply type in this link here and bookmark the link, and it'll take you directly to a chronological age calculator. It's pretty simple to use. So in terms of score comparisons, we got to consider, who are we comparing a student's score to? There's a nomothetic approach and an ideographic approach. So nomothetic comparisons are, you're comparing an individual score to a group-based score. So for instance, you give a child the Wyatt, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, and you compare their scores to those norms. You're making a nomothetic comparison because you're comparing an individual student's score to a group-based average score. The ideographic approach is different in that it compares an individual's score to his or her own previous performance. So the student themselves acts kind of as their own control or their own comparison. So predominantly within the educational realm, we have criterion reference tests and norms reference tests. So criterion reference tests, you're comparing the student to some sort of predetermined standard of performance. So proficiency criterions, the publishers of the assessment or the creators of the assessment simply determine what level they feel is necessary for a student to show in a given skill to be deemed proficient in that skill. And that's really just dictated by publisher. Mastery criterions are different in that the only way that you can successfully perform on that assessment is by showing mastery of that skill. So a mastery criterion would be, in the context of reading, would be something like alphabet naming. We expect students to be able to name every letter of the alphabet, and we won't really move on from that or stop teaching that until they've reached that criterion, until they've mastered that skill. And then there is empirical criterions. And so empirically derived criterions are kind of like a marriage of norms-based and criterion reference standards. The most popular empirically derived criterion assessment that I'm aware of is something like DIBELS. So with DIBELS, what they did is they gave students at the beginning of the year like an oral reading fluency passage, and then at the end of the year, those students took the Iowa Basic Skills Test or the Oregon State Standards Test. And what they did was they saw, okay, students at the beginning of the year that read 80% of the students at the beginning of the year that read X amount of words, that's going to be our criterion for the beginning of the year. So, based on that norm group's performance on the end of the year assessment is where the expected beginning of the year reading performance came from. So norms, you're comparing them to, you're making a normative comparison, and then like you're comparing them to what's typical for students of that age or that grade. There are nationally derived norms and locally derived norms. So nationally derived norms, when you go to examine the norms of whatever assessment you're looking at, you want to see that they've used a random stratified sample, that they randomly selected groups from each category. Generally, it's going to be each of the major racial ethnic designations, so African American, white, Asian, so on and so forth. And then also, it'd be nice if those scores were also stratified by SES, as well as something like another common stratification that people use is like mother's educational level, but also there can be some utility if those norms are stratified by disability category, because that just enhances the number of different groups you can compare an individual's score to. And it's also kind of intended to help ensure representativeness of those norms. So if the white population in the country is 60%, then 60% of the sample, the normative sample for a test, should also be white. So the normative samples percentage should match the percentage of that particular group in the broader demographic makeup of the country. That's good, but that sort of representation is somewhat superficial. It doesn't necessarily account for the acculturation of the individuals in the norm group or the participant taking the assessment. So the experience of a white middle-class male in New York City or Chicago would be substantially different than the life experience of myself, who grew up in an extremely rural setting. So it doesn't necessarily take into account the experiences or the socialization processes. One way that some folks have tried to address that is through the use of local norms. So for local norms, your normative group that you're comparing an individual student score came from just that student's school or that student's district. And the idea there is that, one, it matches the racial and ethnic demographics, because students typically tend to be like other students in their schools, but then it also helps provide for some of those acculturation processes as well. Generally, these students are going to come from the same or similar neighborhoods, and that's kind of a proxy as to indicating similar life experiences. But also it helps to control for some of the other external factors, such as students in the same grade in the same school. It could be reasonably expected that they spend a similar amount of time in instruction with a similar or the exact same curriculum, and it's presented to them at a similar proficiency level. So you're really trying to control for as many external factors as possible. So testing and assessment, like we said, the face-to-face meeting is rampant in education, and it's also taken pretty seriously. So it's important. Previously, again, going back to Larry P., Diana, those court cases we talked about, educational professionals have not always necessarily acted in the most ethical fashion. So there has been the publication of several guidelines or publications to guide the use and administration of tests in the school setting. So the standards for educational and psychological testing, they were a joint venture the American Educational Research Association, the APA, the Code of Fair Testing, should be an E there, Code of Fair Testing Practices in Education. It's published by the APA. Guidelines for Test User Qualifications, published by the APA. National Association of School Psychologists also has a guiding document regarding the ethics of testing and assessment. So let's get into some psychometrics. So psychometrics involve the analysis of the data derived from the use of a test. When people say, it's a common mistake, I'm sure I make it myself, tests are not reliable. Tests are not valid. Only data can be reliable, and only data can be valid. So, reliability, the predominant theory of reliability that underlies or undergirds test usage is based on this idea of classical test theory. And so there's a little formula over here. And the important thing to understand is that every measurement ever conducted in the history of humankind has been subject to some form of error. And so whether that's writing down a number wrong, or a radar gun hasn't been calibrated in a week or two, something along those lines. Every measurement is subject to one form of error or another, be it environmental, be it human. And this formula kind of summarizes that. So the X is the individual's observed score. That's the score they actually got on a particular test. Their observed score is equal to their true score, that if there was no error at all, that's the exact score that they would get, plus whatever form of error is present. There could be numerous forms of error. It could be environmental error, in that maybe the lights are too low and they couldn't see the materials. Maybe it was too loud in the door in the room next to them, so the student couldn't concentrate. It could be error related to, it could be score error. Maybe the assessor wrote down the wrong answer. Maybe the assessor calculated the numbers wrong. It could be any number of things could result in error affecting an individual's true performance on a test. So that's why it's important that we consider reliability. And so reliability just provides us with an indication of the consistency of scores, or the generalizability of scores. So are those scores reliable? Are they consistent across time? Are they consistent across score? Are they consistent across similar but alternate forms of the same test? And generally when we use a test, you can find reliability coefficients in the test manual and also in the independently produced literature. So Assessment for Effective Intervention is a good journal to check on that. The journal Assessment is a good journal to look for those sorts of things. School Psychology Review oftentimes talks about some of the psychometric properties of assessments. But when we make high-stakes decisions, so with something like eligibility, typically we want reliability coefficients to be 0.9 or greater. That means that that data that's derived from the test is highly reliable. For things like screeners, like 0.7 to 0.8, 0.6 is necessary for research, and reliability coefficients below that means you probably shouldn't be using the test at all. And another important consideration of reliability is confidence intervals. So I'm sure you're all familiar in one way or another with confidence intervals. So we just had an election in 2016, and confidence intervals are often used when reporting polling data. So it would be 20% of those polled said that the color purple is their favorite color, but it was 20% plus or minus 5. So that could mean that plus or minus 5 means it could have actually been 15% or 25%, but there was some sort, it's accounting for the error that could have impacted those percentages. And next week we're gonna work with how to use some of our data to calculate reliability coefficients and to construct confidence intervals around some data derived through the use of curriculum-based measurement. So there is many different forms of reliability. So internal consistency takes a look at the homogeneity of the items. Are the items similar? Are they measuring the same skill or the same dimension of the same skill? It's at the item level. Test retest takes a look at the stability of scores across time. So if a student's given a test on Monday and they're given the same test on Friday, those scores should be stable. They should be highly similar. And that provides us with the ability to make some interpretations based on the pattern of performance. Inter-rater agreement or inter-observer agreement is generalizability across different scorers or different observers. So let's take a written expression, correct writing sequences. It's a curriculum-based measure used to assess writing. So scorer 1 should be able to read a student's written passage, and their score should be, if they follow the standardization process of scoring, should be identical or very highly similar to scorer 2's score for that student. And then there is alternate forms or equivalent forms. So that takes a look at the interchangeability of different versions of a test. Prime example of that is something like Ames Web or DIBELS. With the oral reading fluency, the student reads a different passage each time, but they're similar tests. So they should be somewhat correlated. And we'll talk about some of the nuance of like alternate forms with curriculum-based measurement next week. So one other important thing about reliability is that reliability is absolutely necessary to validity, but it's insufficient. It's absolute. A test must be reliable, but it's insufficient. And so an example of that would be, I don't know if they still use them in shoe stores or not, but I remember being a kid and they would measure your foot and they would use like a scale, and you'd put your foot in there and it would give a measurement of your foot. It was a big metal thing. And so that would be, let's say, Professor Doc was like, hey, I've created this new IQ assessment, and essentially it's just that measurement of the foot. That would be highly reliable. It would give you the same measure nearly every single time from nearly an infinite number of different raters, but it would be invalid. It wouldn't be appropriate to use to assess IQ because it's not related. So it would be reliable, but it would be insufficient. All right. So validity is the big one, and validity evidence helps guide the inferences that we can make based on a test scores. It really tells us what we can use the data from tests for. What kind of decisions does it inform? And kind of the big theory, the Trinitarian theory, takes into account 3 different forms of validity evidence: content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity. And these are facets of validity that are related to the test data, where Messick's idea of consequential validity isn't necessarily related to the data of tests, but related to the decisions made based on the data. It's an important distinction. So content validity takes into account the actual items or the content of the test. And so it's broken into something like sampling validity. So the items on the test, do they measure all the different facets of whatever skill you're looking at? And one of the big things of content validity is face validity. And face validity just means if somebody were to look at a test, on the face of it, does it seem to be measuring what it purports to measure? So it's really kind of like, do the people who intend on using it feel like it's appropriate for what it's being used for? Content validity is non-empirical. A lot of it's based on professional and personal opinion or judgment. Then there's criterion validity. Criterion validity is broken into concurrent validity and predictive validity. So within concurrent validity, you take a test and you compare the scores on test A to an already accepted gold standard test, or test B. So test B has been shown that it is highly reliable, and the data is highly reliable, and the data is highly valid for its intended use. So you compare scores on A to that established test, and the scores on test A should be highly similar to the scores on test B for it to show that its data possesses concurrent validity. So in concurrent validity, those tests are administered at the same time or within extremely close proximity to each other. With predictive validity, you're trying to do just that. You're trying to use test A to predict performance on test B. So there's a time lag between those administrations. Classic example of this is like I talked about with the empirically derived criterions in DIBELS. So you give oral reading fluency at the beginning of the year, and then you see how closely associated scores on that test are to scores on end of the year PARCC. And the reason you're trying to figure out that relationship is because then you can predict performance on the end of the year based on the beginning of the year assessment, which allows you ample time to intervene if necessary. Then there's construct validity. So is the test really measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, what it purports to be measuring? And so there's a bunch of different lines of construct validity that can be collected. So for example, age and developmental changes. You compare a child's test performance across time to observe the growth on that particular skill. So a good example of that would be something like mean length of utterance, and speech and language pathologists use that measure pretty frequently. So students or children that are 1 year old, their utterances typically aren't going to be longer than a single utterance, like da. But as they get older and they develop, then their utterances should get longer. So to go from da to da da, or to go from da da to hi da da, so it went from 1 to 3, and that corresponds to the developmental changes in language capacity. Then there's also distinct group differences. So within distinct group differences, you have two groups that have a known difference on a particular test. So an example of that would be, let's say you have a math test that you're trying to see if it's sensitive to distinct group differences. And you've got a group of students without learning disabilities and a group of students with diagnosed math disabilities. So since that's a math assessment, it would be expected that the children without the diagnosed mathematics disability would perform better on that math test than the students with a diagnosed mathematics disability. And then finally, we have convergent and divergent validity. So data from tests that are measuring similar things should converge. They should all point to a similar outcome. And then data that's measuring different things should not be related. So, for instance, if you have a student that has anxiety but no known sort of like depression, then you should have multiple measures would all point towards the presence of anxiety, and a measure of like adaptive skills, and would not be related to a measure of anxiety. That would be divergent, because it wouldn't be expected that the adaptive skills would suffer based on the anxiety. So they're measuring two different things, so they shouldn't be related. Scores measuring a similar thing should be related. So, some concluding thoughts here is that, again, reliability is necessary but insufficient, and reliability and validity coefficients vary, but in general, as a rule of thumb, the higher the better. Any claim that is made about a test use or what it can be used for absolutely has to be questioned. Like the whole idea of show me. Make them prove it. If you have a test publisher that comes to your district and wants to sell you an assessment, or you've got teaching and learning folks that tell you you have to use this assessment because it does this, they're the ones making that claim. So they're the ones that has to substantiate the evidence for that claim. And then finally, like we talked about the face-to-face, the burden of valid inferences is on the test user. Tests don't diagnose people. People diagnose people. Tests don't make decisions. People make decisions. So it's absolutely necessary that you understand what your tests can and can't do, and then act in accordance with that knowledge. So that's just a brief primer, and I'll have some. Next week we'll work with a data set to come up with some reliability coefficients, and then also calculate some confidence intervals. So I'll see you then.